Welcome everyone to FIJ's webinar on covering child welfare issues. I'm Cheryl W Thompson, Senior Editor for Station Investigations and Investigative Correspondent for NPR. I'm also Vice President of FIJ and Board Chairman and immediate past President of Investigative Reporters and Editors. I am thrilled to introduce the panel for today, three of whom are FIJ grantees. Karen Desai is a veteran investigative reporter and executive editor of The Imprint, a nonprofit news organization that focuses on child welfare, juvenile justice, mental health, and education. Karen is a former investigative reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Jose Mercury News, and she was a Goldsmith finalist and IRE Award winner. Woo, woo, woo. Her investigations have prompted new laws and the revamping of various public institutions that deal with some of the country's most vulnerable and at-risk citizens. Ashley Hackett is a freelance investigative reporter and the newly minted Washington correspondent for MenPost, a nonprofit news outlet in Minnesota. Ashley published a terrific story in the Washington City paper here in DC in April with the help of an FIJ grant that showed child abuse reports to the DC hotline plummeted during the pandemic because teachers who often see the abuse and report the cases to authorities didn't have the same in-person access to kids who were being abused as they did before COVID. Juliana Schatz, Preston, is a graduate of Columbia University journalism program and a documentary filmmaker whose first film, Los Comandos, made the 2019 Academy Awards shortlist in the documentary short subject category, which is like an impressive feat. It was one of 10 that made the cut out of 104 films. Yes, I counted. And with an FIJ grant, Juliana directed Waiting for Tiara, a short film about a Connecticut family's struggle to get psychiatric care for their deaf 16-year-old daughter, who also struggles with behavioral issues. That story aired on PBS Frontline in 2019. And last but certainly not least is Gunita Singh. She's an attorney for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. She's an expert at public records laws and using FOIA to foster transparency and accountability of government agencies. Before coming to the Reporters Committee, Gunita was with the DC-based government transparency organization, Property of the People. So I want to welcome our guests this morning, which will turn into this afternoon. And I want to start with Karen. So Karen, in April, your news org wrote an interesting story about kinship caregivers in Kentucky and how grandparents and other relatives are basically getting nothing to raise kids who have been the victims of abuse and neglect. And another story in Nevada, both of which are part of an ongoing series on hidden foster care. So talk about those stories a little bit and how your reporters found them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm really glad that I got to work on these stories as an editor at the Imprint. I feel like this project came to us, it wasn't the kind of traditional investigative project I might have done at a newspaper where it had a very damning, digestible premise and a clear villain and clear next steps for impact. It really involved a very nuanced approach to exploration. And so what we did is partner with different news agencies across the country, nonprofit Center for Investigative Reporting in Kentucky. We ran a story that had originally been published in the Appeal, and then we worked with the Nevada Independent and our staff writers, and we did op-eds and we did a podcast basically examining this premise. So in a nutshell, the formal foster care system, as we all know it, involves millions of calls that come into these child abuse prevention hotlines. Social workers have to sift through these and vet. They go out and investigate the ones that seem most concerning, and then they go through a formal accountability process where they file a petition in court and there's representation for the parent and the child and the social worker, and they have to present evidence and they have substantiated claims, and through that process children can be removed from their homes. There is something that we on this outlet where pretty much we are steeped in child welfare, and that's kind of all we do along with youth justice, had heard about for many years, which is we were calling shadow foster care. A very important law review article came out last year by University of South Carolina professor Josh Gupta-Kagan. He coined this phrase and quantified for the first time what this hidden foster care system looks like. So this, on the face of it, does not sound so terrible. What it is instead of being formally filed on as, you know, as a parent accused of abuse and neglect, a social worker comes to your house and makes some kind of informal arrangement with you where we're not going to file, but we're going to make an arrangement. Maybe you'll sign a voluntary agreement, but your child needs to leave your home and go stay somewhere else with auntie or with grandma. So nobody wants kids in foster care, right? Very, very bad outcomes. This arrangement, however, has a lot of concerning elements. So the concerning elements that we explored, mainly through people and their stories and grandparents and relatives, and also, you know, backed up by attorneys and the usual host of child welfare experts in different parts of the country, these are the concerning elements. Number one, parents are going into these voluntary agreements and sometimes signing documents allowing for the transference of custody of their children with no legal representation and no legal advice at all about the arrangement. Second of all, there's no accountability. No one's really counting this. No one's tracking it. There's no oversight. And third, there is low-income caregivers, for the most part, these relatives and grandparents who are taking kids sometimes in states of crises, in emergencies, in the middle of the night, without the resources that a foster parent or licensed relative caregiver might have, right? So they can be overwhelmed. So children, not only are they like tapping their retirement and SSI and their limited income to care for the children, but they are also not granted the necessary therapeutic benefits that children who are traumatized by the removal from home and whatever else has gone on in their lives really need and really are, you know, are allowed under formal foster care placement. So those are the concerning elements. If I have another minute or two, I can get to my 3 tips for covering child welfare. I can also get to those later if you want to move on to the next panelist. But I do have my tips. I've covered child welfare for the better part of 25 years as an investigative reporter, so I would love to share these at some point on the panel, but I don't want to.
No, you know, go ahead, just because in case we run out of time at the end, I want our participants to have some takeaways here.
Okay,
you know, some tangible things that they could do.
Terrific. I'll just get these out there. So just as we as a nation are really reconsidering many of our fundamental assumptions or understandings of mass incarceration, policing, and the criminal justice system. This country, I can't emphasize this enough because this is all of our work at the imprint of the last 2 years. We really need to reconsider the foundational assumptions about the child welfare foster care system. There are a few facts that anyone on this beat, investigative or otherwise, needs to fully understand before you do any kind of story. Number one, the term family separation was so heart-rending when we heard it, the immigrant and migrant children being wrenched from their parents. Our hearts bled for these children. So the term family separation, however, is not used at all in the context of foster care. But please consider these facts. The people and families most impacted by foster care are Black families and Native American families, disproportionately at rates that are 2, 3, 4, 5 times in other groups. Historically, please consider the historic context. We are going to look back and have to reckon with the fact that Native families suffered horrific consequences from genocide and boarding schools, family separation. Black people who came to this country, enslaved, family separation, fundamental to that historic and brutal legacy, right? So when we look back at these times, that is important context to remember. The second most important context is that the vast majority of children, the vast overwhelming majority of kids who go into foster care, it's not for verifiable and substantiated abuse like we think of it, beating, sexual abuse, physical abuse. It's this amorphous category called neglect, which everyone from Trump child welfare officials now and Chapin Hall and all the bigwigs in child welfare are now saying poverty is inextricably linked with neglect. And we are removing children from families for neglect, for poverty, for not having a home, for not having food, for struggling in the ways that the Senate Democrats are now trying to reintroduce a whole new deal, right? So these are things that are directly correlated with children removed from their homes. Lastly, Every child, just like every person in your family, needs and deserves a family. Imagine being alone in the world with no one who was yours and your blood, right? So your kin, your people. So when we talk about this system, we have to always remember that no matter how troubled some elements of all of our families are, regardless of our race or class, substance abuse, mental illness, depression, violent and abusive relationships, these happen to all of us. It's this, we don't all have the resources to deal with these toxic family stresses. And trauma is lifelong unless you get the proper care. So my final point that we can talk about later is how to interview trauma survivors, children and parents, and how to make sure that the reporting process and your story and your interviews don't re-traumatize them. Let them hold on to the control. They don't want to lose control again when they talk to a journalist. That's what we can talk about later.
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions before I move on to Ashley. So the reporter on the Kentucky story, I believe his name was Graham. How did he find the caregivers that he spoke with?
So yeah, Graham Abros worked with the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, and because I am now the executive editor and I'm at a certain level of things, so there were I worked with another editor who worked with Graham, who got that story established, and then we worked with Roxanne Asgharian, who worked with the Appeal, and then Jackie Valley, who worked with the Nevada Independent. But I wasn't at the kind of micro reporting level, but I know that they were all terrific reporters. We also have our reporter Michael Fitzgerald, who I know Eric knows in New York City, who had been working on a piece about safe families for adoption, which is something New York is now considering, which is a faith-based organization that has the same kind of host volunteer relationship with families. Give us your kids, we'll care for them. New York is considering whether to regulate that, and there's a lot of pushback in New York City. So these reporters did a variety of very hard to get families. So that's a good question. I don't know with Graham specifically how he reached his families, but it's not an easy thing.
All right, but you were a reporter, because if you think I'm gonna let you off the hook on this question, the answer is no. So you were a reporter for years, right? You're a good reporter. So how do you generally, like with a subject that is this tough and this sensitive, how do you get people, how do you find them? And how do you convince them to talk to you? And yeah, we're gonna talk about that a little later, but I thought if you could offer some tips to the journalists on this call, that would be great.
Okay. That's a great question. I just don't know how Graham found his family.
Yeah, sure.
So basically, I think the best investigative reporters come off a beat, right? They come off sourcing. Like, how do you get the best story? The journalistic heavens don't drop Panama Papers in your lap every day. That would be wonderful if they do, but unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Just beat reporting. I mean, you guys who are students, like, get a beat, work it. Like, that's all I did. I was like a county reporter, social services, safety net. So you meet the advocacy groups. You meet the lawyers. God bless Gunita and her folks. Like, the lawyers who represent parents are key, right? But these are confidential cases. So she's also gonna hopefully talk about how to work around it. So, I mean, lawyers are key. Foster youth advocacy groups are key. Social service groups, providers, community providers. When you're in the formal foster care system, you get services to reunify your family. You don't get that in hidden foster care, right? So you don't get the interventions. You don't get the batterers programs or the food banks or the housing assistance or whatever it is that you need your family to reunify. There's nonprofits in the community who have clients. It's a bit of a dance to be able to talk to them because they're not allowed to talk about the cases. They're confidential. But if you work the beat and you source up and you prove that you're trustworthy and you'll be kind and compassionate with the people you talk about, and you'll do a very delicate dance with confirming and verifying what they say, potentially with a third party, a lawyer or a community group, then you can find them.
Thanks. No, I agree, and I think that the best investigative reporters, were former beat reporters. Speaking as a former beat reporter, I think sometimes people think, oh yeah, that's all you do is investigate. No, I toiled for many years as a beat reporter and was a pretty darn good one, if I must say so myself. So Ashley, your story in the Washington City paper in April was about how the pandemic has affected the number of child abuse cases that are being reported in the nation's capital. Walk us through how you reported that story.
Sure. Thanks, Cheryl. And also thank you, Karen. I feel like I'm pretty young reporter, I think, relatively.
We
I
all were
graduated
young
a few
once.
years ago. And I feel like I'm taking in a lot of great advice already. So thank you for all of that, Karen. But yeah, so I think that for me, this story actually started a long time ago when I was an intern working on an investigation with the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica while I was still in school. And we were actually looking into kind of a nationwide investigation of kids who were in the foster care system that were then sent to behavioral health facilities that happened to be oftentimes abusive or neglectful of those kids. And just, I spent a long time having conversations with parents whose kids were in those facilities, or with foster care workers, or with mandated reporters. And so my head had kind of always been in that world after I graduated. So when I moved to DC and was working on freelance reporting, of course the pandemic hit, and as soon as that happened, I kind of was thinking about the foster care system again, and realizing that with kids home from school and home from daycare and just away from, even grocery stores, a lot of the time everyone's staying in one place, they just had a lot less exposure to the adults in their life that may have been reporting signs of abuse or neglect. And so if anyone's not familiar with the term mandated or mandatory reporter, it's often school teachers or social workers or daycare providers who are seeing kids day to day, and who are often trained to recognize signs of abuse or neglect. And from there, the teachers are mandated essentially to call social work services, or in DC, it would be the Child and Family Services Agency. So I realized that there was probably going to be a disconnect there when kids were just not in the vicinity of these adults. And so I started looking into the data and found that during the first few months of the pandemic, the number of calls to abuse and neglect hotlines in DC just had plummeted, which is kind of what was to be expected when kids were away from school. So that was the premise that I based my pitch to the Fund for Investigative Journalism on. So thank you, Eric, and everyone else for accepting my pitch for that story. And then there was a lot of work ahead. So I think for the purpose of this panel, I'm going to walk through some of the steps that I took to report the story. And for me, for stories that are talking about hard topics like abuse, neglect, and other things related to the pandemic and the things that children have been going through, I often start kind of at a micro level, going up to the macro level. And so what I started with was talking to teachers. So I called a lot of teachers in the DC area to ask them how things were going. Do you feel like you're losing sight of your students? Because even though you may have them on Zoom, a lot of kids don't have their cameras on, or oftentimes they could even, see some of the signs or see some of the things that were going on at home, which was interesting. So there was sort of this dual thing happening where teachers both were losing contact with kids who were the most at risk. Some kids just didn't go back to school. And then, so they were sort of losing the physical proximity to these children. And then also they were sometimes seeing kids who were moving around to different homes during the pandemic, or they could tell that there were 5 kids trying to study in one room or try to go to virtual classes in one room. So it was this interesting kind of double effect, where it was like a good thing that they were able to see kids at home, but also a bad thing that it was harder to see signs of abuse or neglect. My second step was talking to lawyers. So I think Karen mentioned this before. Child advocacy workers and Children's Law Center in DC, those attorneys are so essential to stories like this, because they are in the trenches, so to speak, every day, talking to these kids, talking to families, and they really know what's going on. So they also informed my story a lot, the lawyers and the attorneys that I spoke with. And I also called some doctors. So I think the interview for this story that was most striking and most difficult for me was with a doctor named Allison Jackson, who heads a pediatrics unit at the Children's National Hospital in DC. And she told me that the number or the proportion of abuse cases that they were seeing in the pediatrics unit had gone up by 79% compared to that time the year prior, which was prior to the pandemic. And at that same time, I saw from data from the Child and Family Services Agency that the number of hotline calls had dropped by 62%. So it was like the abuse cases were up 79, but the hotline calls were down 62. So it just showed that, you know, the most, I guess the worst cases were ending up in the hospital and they had gone up a lot. Meanwhile, hotline calls had gone down a lot. So there was just a clear show of that disconnect happening in the city. And the last step I took was talking to people at the Child and Family Services Agency, as well as members of DC's City Council, and looking at some of the city council meetings that were happening with audits of how kids in the foster care agency or foster care system and just the child welfare agency in DC were doing. So those were the steps that I took. And I think that starting at the bottom, so to speak, or like the more local level with teachers really gives you an idea of how kids are doing at the micro level. And then it just kind of expands to the rest of the system. So those were the steps that I followed. And I think that my story in the end was a pretty wide-reaching explainer of how kids had fared during the pandemic, with, you know, accompanying data and some examples of kids that had suffered during the pandemic. So it definitely was not an uplifting story, but I think it was an important one to just show our city how it had been faring and provide an example for child welfare agencies and the city council to try to build back what they had before and try to make life for kids in DC better. So I have my own set of tips that I could share with everyone on interview tactics. If you want, Cheryl, I can go into that now, or we can talk about that later.
We can talk about it. I have a couple of questions for you, because one of the things I think you did that I thought was smart, and you didn't mention it, was that to help you report the story, you asked for a mentor, right? Someone who could help you understand the DC school system, because that was not your forte, which is really smart, right? To ask for help from someone who's sophisticated about a beat, right? Someone you know is not going to like take your story, right? Someone you can trust. And so what role did that person play, and how did it help you?
Yeah, so I had, as I said, not 10 years of experience as a reporter yet. I'm still pretty new to the game, relatively. And so I had a great mentor who was very experienced in the school beat, education beat, because that was not something that I had necessarily reported on a lot before. And so she definitely helped me figure out kind of which teachers I should be trying to reach and what questions I should be asking of teachers and how much information I could expect to get from them. And that was essential, because that was really, as I said, the base level of this story, and the reporting that I did was at the teacher level. And so that was extremely helpful. And that was another great resource that FIJ gave me in reporting the story.
Great. And one other question before I move on to Juliana is, when it comes to writing about child abuse and the system, and y'all could probably all answer this, it can be difficult to obtain records from government agencies because of privacy laws and getting people to talk. What roadblocks did you run into on this story, and how did you get past them, Ashley?
Yeah, so I think in my case, you know, this is pretty rare in my experience reporting on these types of topics, but I sent Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests to CFSA in Washington, D.C., and they were actually pretty responsive, which I understand is not necessarily common in this city or in most
what's
places.
the acronym mean?
Child and Family Services Agency.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. You said it so fast I didn't hear it. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just going through that acronym all the time. So from them, I requested data for the past 5 years of child abuse and neglect hotline calls, because I wanted to make sure that this huge dip that happened during the pandemic was not just kind of common, because, you know, calls will go down in the summertime, and the pandemic hit around the summertime, but it was a significant decrease. So those records were not too controversial, I suppose. They were really data that CFSA had available. I would say the other challenge that I had in getting records, or maybe not records, but in getting anecdotal information from people, this story was about the kids that were not seen by the system. And so there was not really a great way for me to also find the kids that were being harmed during the pandemic. And so what I did to get kind of a personal angle on this story was I looked at essentially police records. And so I was able to get a narrative of a really sad situation that happened in DC. It was a death of a child in an abusive family. And I used the records that I got from the police here and from Child and Family Services to sort of flesh out details and anecdotes from that sad situation. So there are usually, there are ways to get around it, but that was my experience in this story.
So hotline calls, records, 911 calls, police records, those, good.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question, but I'm gonna save it for later so everybody can chime in.
Okay.
Juliana, talk about Waiting for Tiara and how you knew this was a story worth telling.
Sure. And thanks for having me. This is really just an honor. This started out as just a curious conversation with a colleague of mine, a friend who's an emergency room doctor. This is just the origin story, where he was just completely appalled at how many children were spending weeks in emergency rooms for mental health issues, and he just couldn't get over it. He was an emergency room doctor himself, and he was like, I'm here to make sure that they're alive, but I don't have, the therapeutic, skills necessary to treat these children, and there's no places to put them. And we're talking very specifically about children who are at a point where they need what's called residential services for a short time to stabilize them. No one, I think across the board thinks that a child needs to spend their entire life in a institution, but sometimes for stabilizing purposes. But those places weren't available, and they weren't available because insurance won't cover that kind of treatment, and it's very, very expensive. And then I all of us as journalists, we have a little meter in us when we hear something like that, and it was like, oh, whoa, that's not right. That doesn't make sense. And as I started to dig into it, thankfully with FIJ, because FIJ were the very, very, very first people to support this in an exploratory fashion and allowed me to dig in, and I realized what I thought was bonkers, which is there are well-intentioned individuals who suggest that parents, in order to obtain this very critical and necessary treatment, give up custody to the state, because when the child is a ward of the state, they can then access these services with state money. And this is something that was occurring across the country, and I just couldn't. And I started to dig in a little bit, and you hear these stories about parents who are not abusive, quite the contrary. They're very, very, very invested in their children's health. And were finding themselves in this impossible type of situation where they would give up custody. And then what would happen is that they would then lose their right to speak, to offer, to speak on behalf of their child. And another thing that as a consequence of this is that, the child welfare system in not every state, and that gets into the challenges because we are 50 states of very different rules and regulations. However, oftentimes child welfare institutions in different states are the ones that handle the budget for this kind of mental health care for wards of the state, et cetera. But by and large, child welfare agencies are there to, they're interacting with parents that are not at their best, abusive parents that are neglectful, et cetera. And so what would happen to some of these just poor parents is that they would be lumped in with, they didn't have individuals at the state agencies working with this specific group of parents, and then another one working with, the bad cases of abuse and neglect. They were all lumped together. And so what would happen is that they would be treated horribly, these parents, and sometimes deemed neglectful in the course of all of this. And it was just a mess. just a mess. That felt like something worth pursuing. I started out looking at the whole country, like, oh, okay, let's look at the whole country. Well, how do you quantify this was a huge challenge. And so I decided to look specifically at one state, and that was Connecticut. Connecticut was interesting because, well, it is my home state. And also on the books, Connecticut looks like, if you're going to have a situation like this, on all of the reports, Connecticut looked like a good place to be if you needed mental health care. However, I found a group of parents who had all gone through this. And I thought, I kept asking them, what in this course of events, what was like I was looking for some sort of document, right? And they all told me that when they gave up custody in this sort of traumatic fashion, they all had to fill out something called an uncared for due to specialized needs neglect form. Like there was a little checkbox that said uncared for due to specialized needs. How horrible is that? And so I said, okay, well, that's what I'm going to focus on. And thankfully, I was able to gather those through the Judiciary Department in Connecticut. I tried FOIAing with no real results, but luckily there was somebody in their judicial department that said, oh, well, here's the number. I don't know, she just gave me the numbers. Maybe she wanted to help. Who knows? I don't ask questions. I got the documents. And it was a red flag. So there was that. So this is all like the background reporting. And then, of course, I focused on the film on a mother named Shayna and her daughter Tiara, which I'm happy to talk about. But I don't know if that's just the initial how I knew it was.
No. And I want to ask you about Shayna too. So you said Judiciary Department. For people who tell these stories in Connecticut, what department is that? Is that a state department? Do you mean the courthouse, or is it's actually a state agency?
Yes, it's like sorry, it's been a few years. It's like it's the Judiciary Department in Connecticut. It's the judicial department in Connecticut. Stand by. I'll give you the real name.
Don't you love?
Yeah, it's the Connecticut Judicial Branch. Like basically just it's the courts and everything. And I had a contact there, and I was asking her about this, and I mean, she and I didn't have much exchange in terms of like how horrible. I was like, no, I'm looking for this document where it's checked off, and she provided the goods.
Okay. And so you mentioned Shayna. How willing was Shayna, Tiara's mom, to cooperate with you? Because, it's one thing to be interviewed for print. It's another when your life is like on a big screen, right?
Yeah. So yes. And so those of us who work in the broadcast medium understand that it's a whole other level when you're asking someone to share some of the most intimate details of their life on camera or on radio even. And I like we talk about activist groups, agency, nonprofits. And that was my starting point, because there was actually an organized group of parents who realized, okay, this is wrong, and we need to do something about it. So I started there, and I was interviewing a couple of the parents there, and even though they were active, many of them just couldn't cross the threshold to participate in something like a film. Shayna, I actually heard, this is so wild. So one of the moms was doing an interview for the local NPR station in Connecticut. She was doing an interview, and then they asked people to call in, and Shayna was one of the people who called in. She was active. Her daughter was in the hospital at that point for like a couple of weeks, and she called in, and I was like, I got to talk to her. And I don't know, shoe leather, you find a name, you find a Facebook account, you call them. And I think she realized at that point in time when I met her that this was like a means to an end. She knew that if she went public, this could help her. And I think she realized that once she had a stake in it, she was willing to participate. And I mean, she's just so Shayna is just a gregarious and wonderful person. And I spent a lot of time with her before we rolled tape, before we actually started filming. And we just thankfully had a rapport. And she was like so many, anybody that participates in something like this, the goal is that, you want them to tell you when something's going on, right? So that you can be there to capture it. And she did, and I also strategically picked a place close to where I live. I don't live in Connecticut anymore. I live in New York, but it was close enough for me to, like, if something was going down, I could just pick up, drive, and be there, like, on the day that she was being evicted.
And I think that's a good tip that you probably didn't realize you were given a tip, but that is, like, don't be afraid to, if you're trying to talk to somebody, get them to talk to you, say, you know what, your story maybe even help somebody.
Yeah.
Right? Because people think if they can help, they often want to help. Right. Yeah. So that's a good tip. So to say to people, right.
Yeah, that it can help others. It can help them, you don't want to make any promises, but it certainly could.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Before I move to Gunita, I want to say, like, if anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat. That would be great, because we'll take questions at some point. So Gunita, clearly there are unique complexities when it comes to digging into child welfare issues, privacy issues when it comes to identifying records about children, but aren't agencies required to give broad data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just first of all, I just have to say I read and watched each of the stories and film produced by the grantees here, and I was just blown away by how thorough and powerful they were. So I'm glad to be here. But Cheryl, it's a really, really good question. And I'll start with a very brief overview of the public records landscape and then more precisely answer your question. So each of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia has a public records law, which provides access to records of that state's government agencies. And for a comprehensive overview about the contours of each of those laws, because they can vary considerably from one another, I can't recommend enough that all of you reporters on this webinar bookmark and use the Open Government Guide, which is a free resource available on the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press website. And I think it's going to be an extremely valuable resource for you all, because some states have exemptions to disclosure that deal precisely with juvenile records and some don't. Some states have provisions for administrative appeals in their public records laws and some don't. So all of that is information you'll want to be armed with as you're using these Freedom of Information statutes to access relevant information. And so with respect to the issue of confidentiality and is there an entitlement to aggregate information, absolutely. The structure for accessing government records is designed to enable you at the very least to obtain aggregate data and statistics, which Ashley's piece in the City paper made really great use of. So you're right, Cheryl, that as a general rule, there's usually no prohibition on accessing de-identified or aggregate data. And laws like HIPAA and FERPA, which are specifically designed to protect personal information, with HIPAA, of course, applying to health information and FERPA applying to student records, even those laws whose central purpose is to protect personal identifying information permit the release of aggregate and de-identified data.
And so once a child has died, or once a kid has died from child abuse, can agencies still shield the records even though the kid is dead? Yeah,
that's a really good question. As a general principle, it's recognized in the public records landscape that once the subject of a public record is deceased, generally that subject loses the privacy interests that previously attached to their personal information when they were alive. So that is absolutely a helpful piece of information to keep in mind when you're working in a space where, unfortunately, it's not infrequent that you're going to be covering deceased subjects who have been failed by the institutions who were supposed to protect them. But I'll note that even when you're dealing with those individual cases where you want to do a deep dive into an individual case where the subject may still be alive, it's important to remember that many states actually include a balancing test in their law, which asks the agency to weigh the public interest in disclosure against any privacy interests that may exist in the information sought. And those balancing tests are baked into the public records laws in numerous states: Alaska, California, New York, Oregon, just to name a few. So depending on the state, there can be really useful case precedent that explains what factors should be considered in utilizing that balancing test, such as whether disclosure stands to shed light on agency responses to certain ills and certain misconduct. And of course, another plug for our resources, you can find way more information about those types of considerations in the Open Government Guide that I previously mentioned.
Okay. And as you know, agencies can and often do drag their feet on stuff. OMG, I mean, really, like, it's ridiculous sometimes, right? I mean, there are some agencies that are, I'm more surprised when agencies are really helpful. Always expect them to drag their feet because, you know, that's what a lot of them do. So what should reporters use to try and get these documents, this information, if agencies drag their feet?
That's a really good question. The way Juliana was talking about how she developed a relationship with, I think, one of the staffers at the Criminal Justice Division or some state agency in Connecticut, I definitely recommend that reporters try to cultivate relationships with public information officers. So often I hear from reporters who say, hey, you know, I took the effort to develop a rapport with the Freedom of Information officer and to remind them that this isn't just a tracking number on a FOIA request. There is a reporter on the other end of that records request who's trying to do really urgent, important work to save lives and illuminate the operations and activities of government. So developing that relationship and investing the time in reminding that FOIA officer or public information officer that you're a person trying to do really important work, as basic as that sounds, it's actually one of the most highly effective tools that you have in your toolkit. But from a statutory perspective, a lot of public records laws have provisions for administrative appeals. So what those appeals processes can be used for is if the agency is not in compliance with its obligations under the public records law, you can file an administrative appeal that can help ping them into compliance or get some intermediary to review that agency's compliance. And oftentimes delays qualify as constructive denials. So if the agency hasn't timely responded to your request, sometimes you can file an administrative appeal saying, hey, the 5 business day deadline or 20 business day deadline or whatever the statutory provision says, you haven't met it. So maybe you want to get your act together, or I will commence litigation or get lawyers involved. So those are some good tools you have in your toolkit.
Well, you know, I hear what you're saying, but isn't it, I think reporters have found this to be true that, you know, a PIO, public information officer, or FLAC, as we affectionately refer to them, isn't it sort of they think it's their job to sort of keep this information from us? So would they really care? Because oftentimes I think they think, oh, well, we're gonna write about their agency and we're gonna make their agency look bad. I mean, that's sometimes the mindset of people, when in fact we are just trying to get documents and information so we could do our own story. And so how do you think they really care if reporters say, listen, you know, we're really just trying to tell this story? Do you think that pries loose anything sooner?
That's a great question. I will say that I have seen a wide spectrum of public information officers, and some of them treat these public record statutes more like nice ideas or suggestions rather than laws, which is what they are. But I've also dealt with PIOs who take their job as public servants really seriously. And I have seen them, you know, go out of their way at times to be like, hey, I'm going to do everything in my power to get you the records that we're seeking. But more to your question about, you know, do they view it as their job to withhold this information? I think one of the cardinal rules that I want everyone to keep in mind when navigating the public records landscape in general, but also for these sorts of records, is there's a concept called segregability, which is absolutely a cardinal rule of public records laws, which says that if parts of a record are exempt and parts of a record are not exempt, the agency is usually statutorily required to redact the exempt information and then produce the rest of the record rather than withholding the entire record in its entirety. And once again, the majority of public records laws have explicit provisions containing that requirement. So if you happen to be in a situation where you're requesting certain reports and the agency is claiming they can't give you anything, chances are the agency is flouting its duty under the law, because even if there's PII such as names or addresses in those reports, there's usually no reason why they can't simply redact those and produce the remainder, which is still likely to be useful if it includes information like dates or response times or the nature of the incident involved.
Well, that's a nice transition into a question we have from one of our guests. Is Melissa from California said her experience in California is that she has access to case records, but they are often over redacted. We've all seen that with blank pages, right? Just nothing but redactions. At one point, she said they tried to charge her for every 15 minutes of redaction. And so what she did, she wrote a letter to the County Board of Supervisors, sounds like Los Angeles, and got the records released. But is there language that journalists can use regarding redaction? That's her question.
Yeah, so once again, that segregability principle is absolutely your North Star. So if a record is overly redacted, you want to consult the Open Government Guide and see, okay, are these redactions justified by the exemptions to disclosure that are included in that statute? Maybe they're not justified. Maybe the agency hasn't even cited the exemptions that they're invoking. That's a big problem. They have to tell you why they're redacting or withholding this information. Maybe they cited the exemptions, but they haven't explained what tethers that exemption to the material at issue in that particular record. The burden is inevitably on the agency to justify its withholdings. The burden is not on you to pry that information out, although it often feels that way. The burden is on the agency to justify its withholdings. So if you're in a state that has provisions for administrative appeals, you want to take advantage of those by saying, hey, I don't think you've adequately justified these withholdings. And further, there's a really strong public interest in this information. So include all of the information you can in your appeal about why the public and the press deserve access to this information. And even if you're not in a state that has an administrative appeal provision, I think California may be one of those states, there's nothing stopping you from informally engaging with the agency about the public interest, the balancing test that we just mentioned, the potential for them to be abusing those exemptions rather than narrowly construing them, which is what agencies are required to do whenever they're redacting information.
But how do we know whether the redactions are legit, right? Because it's been redacted. You don't know whether that's something they can legitimately redact or not.
That is a great question. And it actually reminds me of a note I took when Ashley was talking. So Ashley had mentioned that she sought records from both the DC Metropolitan Police Department, but also Child and Family Services. So I think that using that kind of triangulation approach where you're covering all your bases by submitting FOIA requests to this agency and this agency, or maybe let me do a federal FOIA request and also some state level requests, which may be less relevant for child welfare, I'm not sure, but cover your bases by, submitting requests to various agencies throughout the state and the locality. And that way, if some of those exemptions are being improperly invoked by one agency, maybe the other agency is taking its job more seriously. And so this has happened to me more times than you will believe, where I'm asking for the same records from multiple agencies, and this one is heavily redacted, but this one isn't. So I'm seeing, okay, what's under those redactions? I use this as an exhibit in an administrative appeal to that agency. I say, hey, this is what you're trying to cover up. And they're like, oops, our bad. But granted, often you don't always have the benefit of that, right? So that's where getting a lawyer involved can be helpful. And another plug for Reporters Committee, we have a hotline staffed 7 days a week by media lawyers, and we're here to help you every step of the way through your public records journey. So please take advantage of us.
Yeah, or that's great. And sometimes back in the day, at least, I covered DC police. I spent 22 years at the Washington Post before I came to NPR. And back in the day, they used to have FOIA people take a marker so you could hold it up to the light and like, they don't do that anymore, so I guess I can know that secret.
That happened to me in 2019, actually, with the.
Oh, they did? Oh, that's nice to know. Well, now they're going to stop.
Amazing. I was like, oh, okay. Got it.
I know. It's like, oh, that and reading upside down, I'm brilliant at. So thank you on that. And I have another question for you, Gunita. There's another question about records. This is from Scott. He's seen a lot of states with statutes that say something to the effect of all information in the child welfare database are exempt from public records law. Do you have any tips for, hang on, somebody just emailed me that blocked his request. Do you have any tips for working around those broad exemptions?
So unfortunately, those are harder because a lot of times exemptions to disclosure are discretionary, where even though the agency may withhold information, they're not required to. But some exemptions are mandatory rather than discretionary. And in the federal FOIA context, that's called a B3 exemption. The name varies at the state level, but that basically means you might be out of luck depending on the statutory provisions at play in a particular state, because sometimes the statute is worded where it leaves no wiggle room and no discretion whatsoever. You know, all records pertaining to juveniles are mandatorily exempt. But even there is a way to get creative, and I'll give an anecdote. There was a case in New Jersey where a local newspaper, the Trentonian, was trying to get records about police incidents where they're using force against minors. And in New Jersey, that is a state where there's a statute which says all information housed in government records pertaining to juveniles must remain confidential. So the Trentonian engages really great counsel in New Jersey who argues before the court, but if we redact the names of the children, which just leaves information about police officers, these don't relate to juveniles at all. They relate to cops, and we're trying to learn about police misconduct. And fortunately, the court sided in favor of the newspaper, even though the township didn't want to hand over the records. So even there's ways you can sort of get creative if you're trying to shed light on the actions of the police or, you know, the Child and Family Services Agency. You can say, hey, just redact the personally identifying information and still hand over the rest of their records.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question to the group. How do you report fairly on the role of race when it comes to child welfare? Because both in the Kentucky story and the City Paper story, the lead cases were Black people. And I can't tell you how many times, you know, I've back in the newspaper days, you open on the front page, there's a picture of a Black single mother, and it's either a welfare story or a child abuse case. I mean, how do you erase that stereotype, and how do you sort of report fairly on that?
I'll start.
Juliana.
Yeah.
I'm in.
I mean, I think in the case, I mean, this story was, I mean, a little bit different in that it was less about actual abuse, et cetera. But I think making your, you know, your lead interviewee somebody who is working to make change, I don't know, showing how much, I don't know, humanizing them as a parent, making sure, I mean, Shayna was, you could just see how hard she was working to find healthcare for her child. I don't know. I think just making sure that you're not just presenting an individual as a victim or a perpetrator, you know, just making sure that that they are there and showcasing how, I don't know, I guess to break that, whatever the stereotype is just, I mean, finding someone, I don't know, like Shayna, someone who is a boss, who's just, you know, really handling and asking questions and holding people accountable. I don't know. I felt like she, as an individual, was really great as a character, character is a bad word, but you know what I mean, a lead person in the story, just because she was so strong and she didn't want to be presented as a victim.
Yeah, and she was doing just the opposite. She was trying to find help for her child, trying to get help for her child. Okay. Anybody else want to touch on the race issue, which is always a little tricky?
Yeah,
but worth talking about for sure.
Right, and I think that self-introspection for our profession is the question that should be asked. I think that, as I said, I worked hard since I got to the imprint to make sure that the foundations of race and racism are embedded in our coverage of child welfare and juvenile justice, because those are the communities most impacted. But I've also tried I almost didn't take this job because they did not need more white reporters and editors. And I think that diversifying newsrooms is what needs to happen. And I don't know that I'm helping that particular problem, but to the extent that I can be a part of hiring, and we're, by the way, the imprint is hiring reporters. Since I came on, we're opening up 2 or 3 more reporting positions. So I encourage all applicants. We're working with the Emma Bowen Foundation. We have 2 student of color journalists working with us this summer. And I think that diversifying the people who do this work and this workforce is the question that we need to be asking industry-wide.
Great. Anyone else? If not, I've got one question before we wrap up, and that is, how can reporters do similar stories like all of you guys did in their communities?
I can touch on that a little bit. I think, so like I said, the original idea for this story came from something that I was working on in Chicago, but that story was also focusing on the entire nation, not just Illinois. And I think that using other child welfare stories as a model to understand what state agencies were used and what people reporters talk to do these stories is something that can really be replicated anywhere. And so for me, I mean, this story, like the story that I did, it could have been done about any state. It just happened to be DC because this is where I live and this is, you know, the community that I'm in. So I think that there are a lot of really great formats or templates that you can look at in other stories that are similar to what you think may be going on in your community, and to use those resources as much as you can.
Great, thank you. And so on behalf of FIJ, I would like to thank our panelists. You guys were amazing, and the audience for participating today. I hope you guys are excited to go out and find incredible investigative stories like these to tell. And if you need help telling these incredible stories, our next deadline to apply for an FIJ grant is September 13th. You can go to fij.org for more information, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Cheryl W T, and I can pass on the information to Eric Ferrero, who is our executive director. And again, thank you guys so much.